We'll start with our Seahawks here, who played 2 games technically over the past week of what we cover last week. Obviously, with Monday Night Football, we didn't have that available because we record earlier in the day. So we look at this game on Monday night against the Broncos, a 17-16 win, absolute nail-biter of a game. It was 12 years to the date that Pete Carroll had actually won his first game as the head coach of the Seahawks. This one was pretty wild. I mean, the offense was able to look pretty competent for a good amount of the game. There were 2 goal line stops where the Broncos fumbled on the goal line. The Broncos got a kind of a fluky touchdown when Kobe Bryant got beat. Well, I mean, not fluky necessarily then. And it all came down to a late game situation. Russell Wilson and the Broncos had the ball, and Nathaniel Hackett, the head coach of Denver, decided to put the game in the hands of Brandon McManus, who's got plenty of leg, but attempted a 64-yard field goal that, 64 yards is kind of all I have to say. Instead of using your quarterback, who you signed to this mega deal and made this big trade for in his first game back in Seattle. And Seattle was able to skirt out with a win. Like I was kind of saying leading up to this game, Pete Carroll tends to get his team up for these bigger sorts of games. And they did. Pete Carroll was able to get the Seahawks up for this game. Denver, I'm sure they'll look better than they have in these first 2 weeks as we get on through the season. They played a really ugly game against the Texans and were able to win that one, but still did not look at all how people would expect them to look. Seattle showed out. I mean, good usage of all 3 tight ends. Geno Smith moved the ball pretty decently well. The run game looked pretty solid. The defense had its moments, but again, this was a big game. I expect you to get up for big games. That's what Pete Carroll tends to do. So we look at that game. Here's your inactive list against the Broncos. Isaiah Dunn, Artie Burns, so the veteran corner still kind of going through some things. DT Miles Adams was inactive for this game, so LJ Collier active instead of Adams, which is an interesting move to me. Long snapper Tyler Ott still injured. We might not see him for a bit. Offensive guard Damian Lewis was not able to go against Denver. Instead, filling in was offensive guard Phil Haynes and Ken Walker III, pardon me. I know I only says 2 there, but Ken Walker III unable to go, in the opener there. It was a really interesting game. The offense, again, was able to stay competent, had a good, solid balance to it. The defense had some lapses, but it was more of that bend, don't break sort of thing that we saw throughout the majority of last season to an extent. So it was a solid game to build off of. And you think, okay, maybe we've got some things to work on here, but you look solid. We'll get to that 49ers game, but first we'll look at offensive and defensive players of the game. Since Belle's not here, we don't really have her input on those things, unfortunately. But I think offensive player of the game not much needs to be said here. Geno Smith played a pretty solid game. Had that quote after the game that they wrote me off. I didn't write back. The world was feeling high on Geno. And 23 completions, 195 passing yards, 2 TDs, 14 rush yards. Not a crazy game, but he did what he needed to orchestrate the offense and just lead a competent offensive game plan. On the defensive side of the ball, you could have gone with a couple guys. Mike Jackson, the cornerback, not the legend himself, had a solid game, 2 fumble recoveries. Both of those ones, the times that Denver fumbled in on the goal line, Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams fumbling away 2 opportunities. But I went with Cody Barton here. Barton, 10 total tackles, 8 solo, a sack, 2 tackles for loss, and a QB hit. Really was all over the field. And I'll admit, I was pretty skeptical about the inside linebacker position outside of Jordan Brooks once Bobby Wagner left. I haven't been the biggest fan of Cody Barton in his time in Seattle. while he was backing up Bobby Wagner. But he showed out in this game. He really showed out, and that's what Seattle's going to need in this new 3-4 defense, having two inside linebackers. Obviously, Jordan Brooks is going to be there, but you're going to need Cody Barton to step up, and he played really well in that game. So, I mean, you got what you needed to out of that one. We look over to the 49ers game, which was yesterday on Sunday, and this was just an ugly one. This was just an ugly one. A 27-7 loss. The only Seattle points coming off of a blocked field goal for a touchdown by Mike Jackson. It's the first time that the Seahawks have got a touchdown off of a blocked field goal since the 2012 season. I believe it was Richard Sherman who returned it. Red Bryant blocked that kick. It was against the 49ers as well. I believe that was a Sunday night football game. But yeah, this one was just ugly. Trey Lance went down early, came out of the game with an ankle injury, and his season is over. He had successful surgery today. Fortunately, you never like to see those injuries. That means, though, that Jimmy Garoppolo steps in for San Francisco, and Garoppolo was able to lead a solid offense. Seattle was unable to do, obviously, anything on offense. Just a lot of weird – there were some trick plays in there. DJ Dallas to an interception. Just couldn't move the ball. The tackling, again, was poor. In that Denver game, the tackling was poor, but they were able to overcome it, obviously, to get the win there. The tackling was poor. Couldn't stop the run. Coverage was poor. It was just a bad showing. Seattle was down 20-0 at the half. Just unfortunate, just really unfortunate. And it brings you back down to reality to an extent here. You know, you look at this, and the big win, against Denver is obviously a lot of fans see that as the Super Bowl for this team this year. They've accomplished what they need to. They don't need to worry about anything else. And I kind of feel that way. I mean, you're not playing to win the division here with the way that the Rams are going to be. San Francisco will have a good push. But I don't expect Arizona to do too much, honestly. But this team isn't going to win a lot of ball games. We looked at it last week with the preview of the season. I think they can win some games here. You got a solid matchup against Atlanta. I know they put up a fight at the end of their last game in week 2 against the Rams, but this is a bad roster. And you're playing at home. You've got some things to build on. You've got better playmakers than them. You should have a better roster than them. You should, right? That doesn't mean much, but you should win this ball game. So, got the question here. How do you feel about the Seahawks 2 games in? Please feel free to leave a comment. I always am intrigued to hear the different viewpoints on things like this. But again, I don't think we should expect much. I know that, you see that week 1 win. It's like, wow, what can they really do? Will Disley had a good game. You got other guys involved. Kobe Parkinson scored a touchdown. Cody Barton was flying around on the defensive end. Jamal Adams was flying around before he got injured, and we'll get to that in injury news. But this second game against the 49ers was kind of a halter, like a falling back to earth reality sort of game. So we will look at players of the game against San Francisco. On the offensive side of the ball, I went with Tyler Lockett. 9 receptions for 107 yards. So Tyler, despite the slow offensive day, was able to have a 100-yard game. He now has 16 career games with 100 or more receiving yards. And then on the defensive side of the ball, Al Woods, the veteran defensive tackle, had 7 total tackles, 6 solo, 3 tackles for loss, and a pass deflection. So Big Al, a veteran, and this 3-4 defense might see his production slow down, was able to make a good impact there on the defensive side of the ball. And otherwise, a tough day for the defense. So again, tough one. Our inactive list against 49ers. Artie Burns, again, he was closer to getting to going. Justin Coleman was out, so you're missing 2 veteran corners. Safety Joey Blunt, who might have made some impact, was out. May have made some impact considering that Jamal Adams is out, but Blunt was out. Miles Adams continues to be out. Adams played well in the preseason. I expect to see him sooner rather than later. Offensive tackle Jake Curran and wide receiver Derek Young. All of those guys were inactive against San Francisco there on the road. Really tough one. And then we get to other tough news with the news about Jamal Adams. Jamal suffered a quad injury against Denver in week 1. It was in, I believe, the first half as well. We would later find out that he had a torn quadricep, placed on injured reserve. He's not expected to play again this season. Has had the surgery, or is going to in the near future, but just really tough. I know that we've got the thing below us to let me know how you feel about that trade and about Adams as a whole. He's had a tough go of things with the injuries. Obviously having the club on through last year, the broken finger to begin training camp, and then this. No matter how you feel about him as a player, it's a really tough situation. And he's a guy that can do a lot. I mean, set a record for sacks by a defensive back a few years ago, and he's been able to do a good amount. I know the interceptions are a thing that people are talking about. In that game against Denver, he had a ball hit him in the face when he was trying to intercept it. But it's tough, and you never want to see injuries anyway. So just really tough for Jamal, and just wondering what Seattle can do defensively, trying to replicate that sort of production without him, because the Seahawks defense was pretty creative with him against Denver. And now that you've got him out, it's like, how much of that can we replicate? So other sort of injury updates on the 14th of September, Ken Walker was expected back for week 2, and he was able to debut in that second game of the season against the 49ers. Damian Lewis was set to return against the 49ers. He did return, but was had to leave that game, and we'll get to that in a second. And then Tyler Ott, the long snapper, will need shoulder surgery, so that will have him out for a decent amount of time. On the 18th, injury news against San Francisco from that game itself. Shelby Harris, the defensive end from that Russell Wilson trade, left the game with a glute injury and did not return. We would later find out that it was a calf injury, and he should be good to go. It's not serious. Damian Lewis also had to leave that game with a thigh injury and did not return. So despite both of those guys not returning to that game, luckily neither of those injuries are serious. So tough news, obviously losing Jamal for the year. Your long snapper's out, which is something I'd never expect to say. And then some unfortunate injuries against the 49ers. Luckily, though, not serious. We look to team-related notes. On the 13th, after the win on Monday night, it would be announced that outside linebacker Uchenna Nwosu was named NFC Defensive Player of the Week. Nwosu recorded 7 tackles, 1 pass deflection, 1 forced fumble, and 1 sack. This was a guy in the offseason when we were going through the sort of recap and looking at the moves that this team was making that I thought was a sort of under-the-radar addition. Nwosu is a guy that, played some moments down with the Chargers, had some impact plays, but, hasn't really made that breakout. This here in Seattle is an opportunity to do that. And he had a good game, not only against Denver here, but also against San Francisco. Again, I know that was a tough game defensively, but he made some contributions there. So I'm excited to see what Nwosu can do as the season progresses, and how he can sort of set that edge as a pass rushing linebacker in this sort of 3-4 set. We look over to the news on the 14th of September. Some big news here. I know this is one that a lot of fans of the team for a long time have been waiting for. It was announced that officially Shaun Alexander will be inducted into the Seahawks Ring of Honor. That will take place on October 16th at home, obviously, versus the Cardinals. Alexander, if you don't know, is a former MVP, All-Pro, and Offensive Player of the Year. That big year in 2005, helping carry the Seahawks to the Super Bowl. He had 9,000 plus rushing yards and 100 touchdowns on the dot with the Seahawks, spending a very small time with Washington after his time in Seattle. Had that big line of Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson on the left side, Robbie Tobeck in that 2005 team. This is news that I figured was a matter of time for Alexander to be added. You figured maybe the 2005 team as a general whole would be added to the Ring of Honor here, but it's really cool to see Shaun added to that. He was one of the first Seahawks players that I was a fan of, had a jersey of. So to see him be inducted soon here next month will be really cool. That's pretty awesome news to hear about. Yeah, I mean, probably him and Marshawn, the top 2 running backs in Seahawks history. That is really cool, and I'm excited to see how that goes and what other players will be joining the Ring of Honor. I'm sure you'll get some more from that 2005 team. before we see any of the sort of Legion of Boom era Seahawks added to that. But that is cool news to see. Again, the only player in Seahawks history to win the MVP award. He was an All-Pro as well and an Offensive Player of the Year. I don't know if any other Seahawks have won Offensive Player of the Year. I don't believe so. So Alexander set a bunch of marks in that historic 2005 season. As well, I believe it was a rushing touchdown record that would get broken the next year by LaDainian Tomlinson. So regardless of that, we look up to next week against the Falcons, as the Seahawks have a 1-1 record. They are third out of the NFC West after being at the top of the division after that Week 1 win against the Broncos. Again, as I mentioned, this is a Atlanta team that's got a bad roster. They have started out 0-2 to begin the year. They blew a big lead against the Saints in Week 1. This will take place September 25th. With a 1:25 p.m. kickoff time at Lumen Field. So this should be one of the few Seahawks wins this year, but again, I wouldn't be surprised. I've seen crazier things happen.